Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our Hunter experience in Sepulcher with me and Gingi. I'm Rogerbrown, and we're going to be talking about the harder bosses of this raid, from Halondrus to Anduin to then Lords of Dread, Rygelon, and the Jailer. Which specs we thought were good during progression, what our general thoughts were about the fight, now that it's farm, how do we feel about the Hunter class, basically, in these fights. But before we start, I want to give a big shout out to Curseforge for sponsoring today's video. With the Curseforge desktop app, you can manage, download, and update all of your favorite add-ons in one place. And most importantly, Curseforge makes sure that the creators are properly supported. Click the link in the description below to download the desktop app today.
Yeah, so Halondrus onwards, this is when it got really spicy, and we're in for some really exciting bosses. Let's start off with Monsieur Halondrus. the one and only.
This was my favorite fight, first of all. I enjoyed it a lot, even though I did get quite scared whenever we wiped. During progression, but I think the overall mechanics were really nice to play with, and it was a pretty good fight for Hunter. But this is one of the fights where I would say you should definitely play Beast Mastery and nothing else. We really quickly decided that let's just start off as BM, and we never went back from that. We did try a few different Soulbind/Covenants, though. Do you want to talk about that, Mike?
Yeah, so tried both Night Fae as well as Venthyr. The problem with playing Night Fae is that we were phasing exactly on the second 2 minutes, which meant that the boss would simply be walking out of your Wild Spirits, making it so that you would only get like half duration of your Wild Spirits, which makes it very suboptimal to play. So we went with Venthyr, and one thing to say about Venthyr is that the Venthyr Dwarf Shadows was also super helpful on this fight, having to place your bomb in good positions, getting the position to drop down the dispel from the healers in order to slow down the motes walking towards the boss, things like that. Dwarf Shadow was a really good toolkit to use on this fight. So definitely I choose Venthyr over Night Fae on this fight.
Absolutely. And at the start of the fight, we did try 2 different Soulbinds for Venthyr. I think you were trying out Theotar, and I was playing Nadja. I think later on we realized as well that Theotar has kind of the same issue as well as Night Fae does, because of the umbrella or the shooting shade, as it's called, where you have to stand still. And this is just a fight where you don't want to be limiting your movement whatsoever. That's why Beast Mastery is really good, because you can freely move all the time. And so eventually we did both go to just playing Nadja and enjoying the freedom of running around permanently and being annoying to every other caster who is looking at us being like, oh man, I wish I could do this as well.
And we also actually played double potency and went for Dauntless Duelist, which also, on top of being a single target damage increase onto the target that you hit first, you also take reduced damage. And for a fight like Halondrus, where there is a lot of incoming damage, is a nice little extra tool to have. And also being able to, then I played Hunter's Mark as well, damage reduction on Halondrus, as well as utilizing your Feign Death on missiles in order to reduce the damage from the missile intake was also really big. I think the biggest thing you had to focus on this fight, apart from, of course, not exploding the charges, was to mitigate and reduce damage taking from the missiles as much as possible, as well as rotating your smaller personals, using Excel Feign Death to reduce the damage. On cooldown, which makes it a lot easier for the healers for what was a very healing intensive fight back then. That was like the main focus. And then being able to save. If you went into you can use a healing potion early in the fight, but having your health stone and a healing potion in the last phase was very big. And then just being able to survive the last 3 missiles was kind of like where we wiped repeatedly. One person dying pretty much meant that, especially in the range camp or even in the melee camp, because that was one less mode soaker or one person sitting there, oh fuck, my partner is dead. What am I gonna do with my charge now? And then panic happens, and most of the time, 20 seconds later, there was a full team wipe because you could only salvage it for so long, right? So that was kind of the thing that we were wiping to the most towards the end.
Yeah, and so speaking about like defensives in general, I think a great thing we could do was, even though it's not the best defensive cooldown across all the classes, Survival of the Fittest actually was pretty nice to have.
Mm-hmm.
For progression, because you could time it so that you used it on the first reclaim, then the second reclaim, and then in phase 3 you had it ready for the second or third missiles, depending on how fast you were with the DPS. So it was some good usage out of that defensive throughout the fight. And also Turtle as well, fully being able to immune damage was very, very crucial, as well as, like picking up the bomb if something goes bad and immuning the damage completely. The only thing you had to be careful about was, even if you had the debuff, right? So you would normally die by picking up the bomb. If you picked it up with Turtle, you had to drop it before Turtle expired, because it also does damage to you when you drop the bomb. So it was a nice way to salvage potential wipes. Now, of course, that mechanic has been nerfed a lot nowadays, from 10 seconds to 30 seconds. So it's a lot easier and less panicky. But for progression's sake, Hunter just felt very, very nice in this fight. Very mobile. You could go for the worst positions and let the other ranged have the better positions in the fight, and just play your own game freely. So
this was one of the things where, you as a BM hunter, you take the first charge, you play with it throughout the fight, so that some of the other classes do not have to play it. So that some of the classes that do lose some DPS by having to handling it, not only in terms of movement, but also in terms of brain power. Imagine having to pick up a charge like every 10 to 15 seconds and it being constantly on your mind, and you're trying to find a window to use your cooldowns efficiently. You will lose some DPS doing that. So hunters, they don't really. You play with it the whole fight, which allows for other classes to just pump more, right? Which is a good thing. Again, BM Hunter is just good for these kind of things. And yeah, I had a couple heart attacks because even if we did not explode the bomb, when you're sitting there holding the bomb and you're so focused on it, and then someone else explodes, you're like, wait, was it me? But but it wasn't. But just because you're just so focused on your baby, looking at it constantly, I don't know why. I just there's a lot of jump scares when
Absolutely,
because you just see everyone just dead, all red frames dead in a millisecond. Everything can look nice and easy, everything going perfect, and then the next millisecond, everyone's dead on the ground. But for me, this was the most enjoyable fight, this progress, for sure. I really loved it. I do think we could have killed it faster. In hindsight, could have done some things differently, could have played a little bit better on this boss. But in terms of enjoyment, I thought it was a really, really good fight.
Let's go!
All right, so moving on now to the next boss, which is Anduin, and what a boss that was. Definitely a very, very cool fight overall. We kind of expected this from PTR testing. It looked very, very nice. And another boss where, again, you can play both specs. And by that, I mean survival and marksmanship. Do not play BM in this fight. I don't think you're going to have a good time.
Not. Mm-hmm.
And this was a very interesting fight to try out different things. Initially, I did try to play survival from the get-go, and you were focusing on playing marksmanship. And initially, I did try to play Kyrian as Mechanicus because the thought process was, let's get the resonating arrow with the cooldown reduction, and you can squeeze 2 of them into the intermissions. And that worked pretty decently, but it was still not, in the end, it didn't work out as good as we thought. I think I was generally doing less damage overall compared to you who were playing marksmanship at the start. So eventually I did switch to playing Night Fae. I still stayed as survival, which is a very cool thing to have, right? Like we had both of us playing different specs and they both worked really well. But yeah, definitely switching over to Night Fae was the pick here. How did you experience it as marksmanship though?
Yes, so this is something that's a boss where similar to Sylvanas, it's a boss that stays, or you have a lot of good careful aim uptime, which makes marksmanship incredibly good because your aim shots will do increased damage on targets above 70% HP. On top of that, playing Night Fae, Corraine specifically, with First Strike was incredibly good because similar to careful aim, you do get increased damage on high HP targets. Same with the Corraine, the Soulbind. So that's synergized super well. And what really First Strike as well is because there's a lot of ads spawning frequently throughout the fight. You have the downstairs Kingsmorn phase where you're popping a 2-minute cooldown, where you utilize the grips from the DKs, the A-bomb limb from the DKs as well. And because the ads were coming in staggered, you were doing big AoE cleave, but also priority damage while staggering your First Strike downstairs in the Kingsmorn phase. Which made it for really good downstairs, but also in the big pump phase, which is the Lich King phase, where majority of your boss damage will come from. So having your cooldown timings around the intermission phase with the Lich King and having good cooldown usage there, min-maxing the boss damage while still having enough add damage onto the fatty, as I call it, I don't remember his name, but you can cut that
Abomination.
one out. Yeah, the Abomination. That is where you will see yourself getting the boss as low as possible. Nowadays, I feel we actually get him to 10% in the second phase, which is where the boss will force phase into the last phase. I really love this fight. It didn't have the greatest ending, I would say, but I think it was a really, really overall amazing fight, and Hunters were just incredibly good because, again, the Lich King starts 100% HP in every intermission phase. You have good AoE cleave as well from the ad spawnings. The ad spawnings will give you First Strike as well. So everything taken into consideration, it was almost like it was a perfect fight for marksmanship hunters. If there's a fight where a marksmanship hunter would be good, it would be tailor suited to Anduin. Although survival was also really strong. The only thing I would have to say about survival versus MM is that survival's AoE damage is less controllable than marksmanship ones is. Sure, you will get the automatic trick shots, but it's not as powerful as the survival bombs are. So in some cases, having to find the right balance between killing the souls outside in the correct time so that downstairs people did not get the blasphemy, and just balancing out that DPS onto the boss as well as the souls was a lot harder with a lot of survival hunters than it is with marksmanship hunters, which is why we went for the balance of having 1 survival and we're playing 2 marksmanships. But in my opinion, both specs works. It was just the awkwardness of balancing out the soul damage. And I would say that downstairs in the Kingsmore phase, marksmanship is better just because of its front-loaded burst, whereas survival would be very proc dependent.
Yeah, absolutely. Touching on the souls that you mentioned, so in the phase 1 of the fight, but also the second phase 1, let's say, where you get the Grim ads, when you are outside and the other team is inside, you're DPSing the souls, it's very easy to either have too little DPS, AoE DPS, or too much. So striking a nice balance there is very crucial. And I found myself a lot of times as I was the survival hunter in this fight that I had to angle myself towards the boss so that my bombs did not actually hit the ads because they would just die too quickly then. So definitely something to keep in mind. I think if we had 3 hunters, it would have been way too random. One try, we would all 3 have insane procs and then we just kill them too quick. And it would cause a lot of panic. If we had none of them, maybe the DPS would have been slightly tight sometimes to kill those ads. So finding a balance depending on the rest of your raid is important there. If you feel like you're needing more AoE there, survival can definitely do more damage than MM on those ads. But yeah, it's up to you. Also, you need to feel comfortable during the fight. Definitely the key to not wiping there is handling the stars properly. So that's also another point. If you're gonna hit any ad with these stars, it's pretty much an instant wipe. So and I would say MM is probably easier to handle that since you're already ranged, so you already have the distance from the boss and it's just a little bit about the angle. But as survival, you actually have to run away in those couple of seconds that you get before the star shoots towards you. But what was a bit surprising to me is we had talked a lot about this boss before going on live, like from our PTR testing, and I did think that MM was going to do significantly more damage than survival in the intermission phases. It turned out that it wasn't really that big of a difference. It was, I think, about equal, depending, of course, on the survival procs. But yeah, it really surprised me how good the damage was there for survival, even though you don't have some crazy talent like careful aim for MM. So that's definitely something to keep in mind if they keep the specs relatively the same. To not underestimate, I guess, right, the power of other specs, and just try them out, right? Like we just tried both, and that's a very good thing to have. Don't fully focus on one spec.
Yeah, for sure. Like what survival is also really, really good at is the added funnel damage they actually get by having increased, like by having ads around them. Using that carve to get more bomb procs works out super well for them. Something that I also felt in Mythic Plus in general is that when you do pull trash on top of bosses and you look at the boss damage towards the end of the fight, will do really, really good increased boss damage just by limiting the RNG. Because if there's one thing that's like super annoying with Survival Hunter is that if you're just hitting a pure single target mob, and you get bad luck on your kill command resets, you are sitting there doing dry raptor strikes and it doesn't feel good. But having mobs around you using carve makes it feel a lot more smooth to play in its rotation, and that RNG element goes away because you have the carve to cover for it, which makes it so that you bomb a lot more frequently, which gives you more overall rep bombs, which then increases your chance of getting those kill command resets and getting those procs from your set bonus. So that's kind of where like survival becomes really, really good, because MM Hunter super strong in the first part of the intermission phase with the wild spirits, but then it becomes a little bit more dry, whereas the Survival Hunter will continue to pump with or without its cooldowns. Just by having additional adds, you will still bomb, you will still carve, you will still do that good single target damage. So throughout the full intermission phase, survival kind of catches up a little bit to marksmanship, whereas in the beginning of the phase, marksmanship pops off, but then it kind of falls down a bit, whereas survival will just continue to ramp and do steady pump throughout the whole phase, which makes them, like you said, pretty close to each other. And the only thing that will change whether or not survival or MM does better would be the procs that the survival hunter gets.
Yeah, one thing that I really enjoyed was we did have a Blood Decay who would mass grip the small adds in the intermission, the second wave of them. And if you can make it so that you can have a proc ready of your bomb and also 2 charges, and you wait until that mass grip happens, then you just throw 2 or 3 bombs back to back and just obliterate the damage on those adds. That felt so good to do. The first wave was kind of dying by everyone instantly anyways, because everyone has cooldowns. But that second wave, yeah, that's where you can pop off, especially if you have a mass grip in your group. But yeah, overall, great fight for Hunter. Recommend. I think most guilds are playing at least 2, maybe 3 Hunters. And it's a very good fight. Also, you can turtle in the last phase the debuff, so you don't have to clean, you don't have to step into the well in the middle. So that's an extra nice benefit of bringing Hunters in. Let's on to Lords of Dread. And boy, oh boy, that was the boss where I think Hunters really put the stamp on of, yeah, we are the big blasters of this tier. Now, that trend wouldn't continue after this boss, but damn did it feel good to be a Hunter back in Lords of Dread progression. So obviously here, I think it's very restrictive in terms of what you can play. We all went Survival Dreamweaver, so Night Fae Dreamweaver. And I don't think anything is comparable. Of course, you can play MM as well, but it's just not going to do as much damage. Plus, you don't really want to play ranged in this fight. Melee is so much easier. I think we had the minimum amount possible of ranged players in this kill, and yeah, it felt great.
This is actually the first time we went without the mage, so we were so high on the physical damage dealer comp that it was not even worth bringing the mage, because the damage that the mage did was so weak in comparison. They have changed this fight now compared to how it was when we initially killed it, because in the swarm phase, increased damage was only on AoE abilities, whereas now they've changed it so that it is all damage, which makes it so that the fight is a little bit more balanced, which makes some of the classes that was not so strong on our first kill quite a lot better for it now. But yeah,
to interrupt you there, it did make a lot of the other classes, it bumped them up, so you don't need to have as many as much class stacking as we did for our first kill, but it still made Hunters even better, right? Like, it's not like we lost compared to other classes, we just gained even more damage now, so we're still topping the meter. It's just that some other classes don't feel terrible to play, I guess.
No, 100%. I mean, on Lords of Dread, Hunter Survival is definitely up there, together with Destruction Warlocks are the 2 stronger classes for this fight at the moment. With, also, one thing we didn't have on our first kill was double legendaries. So with the, now we have Antlers as well, which makes it even stronger in the intermission phase, because you have the 2 target cleave onto the bosses being amplified with your wild spirits. Your bomb dot is also amplified, like I said, not just the initial damage from the AoE. So Hunter just became so much better now compared to back then, even though there's some classes that are, of course, benefiting a lot from this. But you will see other classes also do super well. Like, for example, Destruction Warlocks will be popping off now with this change, whereas you didn't really see Warlocks pop off as much before with this introduction of this change. And also, by playing limited ranges, they have to deal with all the range mechanics. And of course, when you're dealing with mechanics like that, especially something that's like disorients you for 2 seconds every time you swap it between players, you will lose a lot of DPS just by having to deal with that alone. So we had 1 Warlock, I believe, and then we had 3 Priests. That was the only ones that were dealing with range mechanics. Everyone else was melee. We were playing, 2 Disc, a Holy, so they were the outside with the Warlocks, and then we had 2 Holy Paladins inside, and then we were just stacking Hunters, Warriors, 1 Enhancement Shaman, and just a lot of DKs. Speaking of DKs, this was a crucial reason why we killed the fight in the first place. And why don't you talk about this spell called Misdirection and how we utilize that as a Hunter to kill this fighter?
So this was a very interesting thing that we did with Misdirection, which I don't think we've done ever in the past. So because the boss was pretty much unkillable until you hit enrage at 9 minutes, we thought, okay, well, instead, how about we focus on surviving the longest we can within enrage, and that will allow us to finish off the boss. So what we had was all of our DKs go Necrolord and have the Forgebone Spellbind, so that they would get aggro from the boss, die, but then still be able to tank the bosses for 10 seconds when they are basically immune, right? Like it's a cheat death, pretty much. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem was, well, what if they're not the top of the threat meter? So what we did instead was we had 1 Hunter assigned to each Death Knight, and we would misdirect them during the big pump phases. So that pretty much guaranteed that the 3 DKs we had would be at the very top of the threat meter at the end. And it worked really, really well. As long as they knew that they were going to get a threat once the tanks died, then they just took their spot, and it worked beautifully. That's definitely makes you feel that you're utilizing the Hunter utility spells to the maximum when things like this happen. So very cool moment for sure.
And an easy way to do that, it was just to add Misdirection to that specific person in your Wild Spirits macro, so that you would never forget about it. That way you just pop your Wild Spirits, your cooldown, you blast, and each swarm phase Misdirection would go on to your assigned DK. That way it would take no additional focus or brain power to do this job. So that was an easy way which we handled, something that you would otherwise think, okay, this is very technical and smart, but this was an easy way to just deal with that mechanic or this strategy, so that we made sure that the DKs, when the tanks were dead, the DKs would be at the top of the threat meter afterwards. And then after the DKs were dead, which, by the way, 10s, they die, boom. Then they proc their Necrolord. Then they have another 10 seconds. Then it goes on to the next DK. He dies, 10 seconds. And so you had 30 seconds of tanking from the DKs from that, from Bonesmith Hamir's Chi Death alone. And then we would go on to the Warriors, which would then die by the sword taunt, And we also had 4 Warriors. So you can see that we could play this fight a crazy amount longer in the enrage phase, which made it so that we could, like, the DPS check was, of course, a lot smaller if you can play the enrage for 2 minutes. So very, very interesting way of dealing with this fight. I really thought it was a fun fight in one way, because it was all blast, but it was not a super complicated fight mechanically, and also the introduction of the Among Us phase was something like unique and new, and I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a super fun fight, and again, no-brainer. Play survival in this fight. Not only will you have a lot easier time as a melee, but you will also be one of the highest damage dealers in the game at the moment for this fight specifically.
Yeah. Speaking of Among Us, one thing, let's go a bit more into detail about the Hunter specifically. Be careful during the Among Us. Even if you know who the sus person is, I would be very cautious throwing wildfire bombs at them because they still cleave the whole raid. And we did have sometimes deaths because of people AoEing too much. So be very careful with that. Unless you know that the person is away from everyone else, instead, maybe try to do single target DPS. You know, you can pop your Astrid of the Eagle, do a couple of Raptor strikes. Don't go too crazy. Apart from that, the good thing was as survival, again, you don't need to be in melee too much. Of course, you do want to carve as much as possible on 2 targets. But you can afford taking a step away to bait the clouds. So that also was a nice, a nice way to handle the mechanic and survival without feeling like you're losing too much.
One thing to add, actually, I forgot to mention, is that, of course, hunters, they can have a different pet utility depending on what pet they play. Leech pet will be incredibly good for this fight. So play a leech pet simply because the highest damage intake you will take is during the swarm phase, and that is where you have increased damage, all your cooldowns. This is the kind of ability where you're constantly taking high incoming damage, and having that leech will support you way more than a damage reduction or increased stamina would. So play leech pet is going to help you tons on this fight, and the best pet you can use because it will just out-heal the swarm phase, making you actually one of the best defensive classes on this fight, which is not normal for a hunter to be in a position like that.
Yeah, let's move on to the next bosses. Which sadly, that's when the era of hunters being really good kind of ends. So Rygelon, it is a really cool fight, and I wish we were good enough to play it, but unfortunately it doesn't really play into any of the hunter specs strengths, because you have spread out cleave, and you also need crazy single target DPS, and you're also taking massive amounts of damage. So it's not like Hunter is terrible at this fight. A good example would be, I think, enhancement shamans on Anduin were really bad. We're not that bad, but it's not necessarily a class you would want to bring for progression. So yeah, not the best.
But Rygelon is a boss that does get nerfed a lot with gear. Because I mean, one of the hardest parts about this fight was the DPS check as well as the HPS check. With more gear, that will be, of course, significantly easier, and also just finding the. I mean, this is also a boss fight where you need to balance your damage, especially on the Quasars. If you had to pick one spec for this fight, the highest output would be marksmanship. Just because you can do good cleave onto the Quasars as well. I didn't play this fight myself. I've been looking into what some of the other hunter players do play on this fight, so that when I finally get in here, I will play, the most optimal thing. And marksmanship does look to be the more popular one. I do see hunters play Deadly Chain, so it does look like they're going for a more of a focus onto the cleave, onto the Quasars specifically, while being able to do good boss damage, right? At the end of the day, Quasar damage is just about finding the right balance. I don't think it was something that you were necessarily lacking if you were focusing on it. It was just being able to optimize the boss damage on our kill, which of course made it a lot harder to do Quasar damage, because in some cases you had too little or too much, trying to wiggle between, optimizing boss damage while, killing the Quasars at the correct times, which is why we were using the Boomkins. They were mainly handling the jobs of positioning the Quasars, slowing them, and whatnot, while some of the classes like the Warlocks, the Rogues, enhancement shamans, they were doing the jobs when it came to pumping the boss. Whereas nowadays, the boss damage is not as important. So main focus to kill this fight is just handling the quasars, and of course rotating between the people soaking the orbs in the faces, whereas something like a hunter is good because of the immunity.
Exactly.
You played this fight more than me. You played in the beginning of Progress Razor. Maybe you want to add something to it.
Yeah, so the one thing that hunters do have is the turtle, and you can use it to soak the cores in the phase ones, let's say, right? So that is something you can argue to get a spot into this boss, especially like Gingi mentioned, we don't really need the single target damage as much as we did at the start. Now with all the gear that's available, so just surviving is the key. And soaking the cores and having people who are able to take no damage from those cores is very, very nice to have. So yeah, that's one thing you got going. I think the biggest argument, though, to bring a hunter into this fight is just because of the gear. It has such good loot for you that it feels really bad not being into this fight. Specifically for marksmanship, not so much for survival. But yeah, it has the weapon, it has the ring.
Yeah, big fat braces.
It has the braces. Like all of the loot is so good. Yeah, also the tier chest, of course. So yeah, it just. I think you just have to hope that your guild likes you enough to put you into this fight, so that you don't miss out on all the great loot that drops. But yeah, it's not. As long as you play a little bit defensively, I would say. Make sure you make good usages of all of your defensive abilities. It's not a big issue, because that's the main point where I think hunters lack compared to everyone else on the ranged camp, let's say, is that it's hard to sustain when there is like constant damage. And also another thing which we should touch upon actually is that exhilaration is not that great, and sadly that's the ability that gets cooldown reduced by the holy priests, by the symbols. When other classes get things like Barskin back, we just get exhilaration. It's not, it's better than nothing, but if your group has a bunch of priests like we did, you have to take that into consideration.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. Hunter is something you would bring, mainly because of the gear that drops from the fight. There is better classes for it, but it's not like Hunter is completely useless. Again, it will do decent cleave in the boss damage department. It probably won't be one of the top damage dealers, but utilizing your cooldowns in order to cleave onto the quasars is where you will see marksmanship be the best at doing that. Yeah, I think it's not bad to bring.
I will say that I think it is, even though MM is, I would say, I agree with you, is the best. I don't think it's unreasonable to also play survival and maybe even BM if you have too much AoE on the quasars. You can play, I would say, all the specs, especially because BM is getting a 4% buff. So it's not like MM is substantially better, I would say.
It would probably do the most overall damage, but maybe not the most effective damage, like you said. Maybe survival will do a little bit more boss damage. Same with BM, just focusing on the boss damage itself. And also, instead of doing the big AoE damage, what BM is really good at is target swapping to one specific quasar. Let's say, you need damage on the left one quick. Well, BM Hunter is really good at doing that. Whereas MM is a little bit slower in their target swapping, having to cast their aim shots. So that's what BM would be good at for this fight, as well as doing the shitty jobs like walking over, using your immunity. Maybe you wanna have more frequent immunities, for example, and BM would be good at doing that job, then again, you can play Born to be Wild as well as the cooldown reduction on the turtle, and then have a turtle every 2 minutes and take some of those shitty jobs from others instead. Would also not be a bad option.
Yeah, 100%. I do think Dreamweaver is the pick, though, no matter which spec you play. So it does suck a little bit that there are some lines that spawn on the ground, and sometimes you'll get the debuff, so you have to go inside the singularity. But it's still, I think, is the best. Overall, you'll have the best outcome by playing Dreamweaver. Plus, you do get that portenter if things don't go as planned. So, yeah, that's my. I'm eager to try out that boss. Let's say I'm eager to see how we do on that boss. Yeah. Shall we move on to the last one?
Yes.
The big boy, the jailer.
Jailer.
Sadly, another fight where we ended up not having any hunters in for the kill, but I would say that it's a lot more viable to play at least one hunter in that fight. We could have done it. It's not like a huge difference, but it still did not feel like we were bringing anything unique. And again, it came down, I think, to survivability of the hunter just being worse, and just the overall utility that you bring compared to something like a druid.
Exactly. I mean, that
it just didn't feel right. Yeah,
I agree 100%. This is something that you were playing in the first reset where we reached the jailer, and then I got in on the reclear, and trust me when I say that I tried every single build that was available to hunter at the time in order to try and make it work. Whereas I unfortunately had to say at the end of the day that guys, I think that the Boomkin would be a better choice. I don't think I bring too much. That was early in progression. We did figure out later on that there was something cool that Hunter did actually bring towards the later part of the fight, something I'll get to in a bit, but it was mainly the fact that the defensive toolkit that Hunter had was not super good. I mean, there was a lot of incoming damage from the Torments. You had the Blood of Azeroth soaks as well, and you know the synergy with the symbols from the priest as well as the barkskin, as well as being able to self-sustain in spicy moments where maybe it was a little bit of a spicy pull, something going wrong. You know, healers have to recover a little bit. In those situations, druids can survive, but Hunter cannot. And that's the bad thing about Hunter in those situations where a Boomkin can just cast a couple regrows. They can go bare form, use your Frenzied regen or anything like that in those situations, and they will survive. Hunter needs to be taken care of, and that's where I felt like we were lacking specifically on this fight. In terms of DPS, you're going to be fine. You're going to do good. You're going to probably do just as good damage as a Boomkin, but defensively, you're just not there. And that's why I felt like it was lagging. I felt we were going to get a lot more consistent progress by not having those silly deaths to a hunter not being able to sustain themselves defensively, and also the added roar, which was very big in this fight. There was a lot of good roar usages that just made it easier to get in position, jump into holes with the bombs, getting to your blood positions, like a lot of those things. There was constant movement of this fight, and roars was a huge help to those type of mechanics.
Yeah, I think it comes down to basically the other classes being just way too good in terms of their utility and just their overall what they bring into the fight. You're mentioning roars, but there's also innervates as another example. So yeah, it's unfortunate. I don't think necessarily I would attribute it to Hunter being bad. It's just the other classes are just too good, let's say. So hopefully something that we will see changed in the future. Let's focus on one part, though, of the fight where I think hunters are really useful, and that is in phase 2 for the mind controls. having binding shot and also the cleave that we bring, especially when we have the cooldowns, can really bring out all of those mind controls very consistently and without having to chain a lot of CCs, just because binding shot is just awesome. 8-second root that doesn't break is just insane. We ended up using so many warriors with the Kyrian spears that we didn't really need it. But if your group doesn't have that, definitely a hunter can be very, very useful on any mind control waves that you do not get mind controlled yourself, of course. So keep that in mind, that is the main argument of something you can bring that no one else can bring as good as you do.
No, I agree. And another thing as well that, specifically Marksmanship Hunter was really good at for this fight, outside of, bringing the binding shot, as well as having good damage on the mind control ads. With having 3 people mind control as well as the boss, that is 4-target cleave. Something that perfectly lines up as well with double legendaries and antlers. In your 2-minute cooldown, you can absolutely destroy a wave. And again, getting 3 of your friends out as quick as possible, that is going to increase the uptime of those 3 mind control people onto the boss. So breaking those out is going to be crucial in order to, get the boss as low as possible and optimize your raid DPS. Something that Hunter is good for. Also, the Torment ads in phase 3 as well. Popping wild spells on those, you will be doing a huge amount of ad damage so that other classes can focus more on the boss damage. So that is something Hunter is also good for. And one last thing, most people know about the Mortal Strike onto the healing shield that the jailer uses when he goes into the hidden phase.
Mm-hmm.
Now, healing reduction effects works on that, as well as what we figured out after a kill. Mirrors of Torment silence effect also worked from the Venthi ability from mages, but we only used Arms Warrior for the Mortal Strike. Now you could avoid playing a Arms Warrior and go for something like Fury, which might be better for the fight overall, and then just swap to a Raptor pet right before the shield is about to happen. You summon your pet, you bring out the Raptor, and then you could have a Mortal Strike effect from the Hunter too, which is something that some of the other, other guilds used instead of an Arms Warrior. So those are the things you as a Hunter can bring to the table in your raid. So, like Roger said, Hunter is not completely out of the question on this fight. It does have its niches, and with increased gear, the defensive toolkit is not as necessary as it might have been in our first kill. So you can easily bring a Hunter to the jailer at the moment, for sure.
Yeah, especially because you do need a decent amount of ranged players to perform the blood mechanic in phase 2 and in phase 3. So it's very, it is compared to Lords of Dread, a fight where having a marksmanship hunter can help you out. It's a good option. It's not something you will feel really bad bringing in. Now I have noticed as well that some hunters are playing Beast Mastery on this fight, and I think it is something to consider, especially if you are progressing on the fight and you're not liking necessarily as much cleave AoE damage for the phase 2 mind controls and the phase 3 the ads that come out of the torments. It is possible to play that spec because of all the movement, like we've talked about in previous bosses. There's a lot of movement on jailer, and that's where BM shines, especially comparing it to marksmanship. Now that you have the new legendary with the 4-set, your movement is a bit worse compared to previous tiers, just because you are aim shotting more often than you used to. So you will feel a little bit restricted, or you will not move as proper as you should be doing compared to a BM hunter. So that's something to consider. I still think marksmanship is the better choice, but something you can look into if you are struggling a lot in that fight, and you still should be doing decent But in terms of soulbinds, I think, well, if you are playing BM, I think Dreamweaver is by far the best choice. Sadly, you have to stand still for your flowers, but you can find some decent timings for that. As MM, I think you can also play the other Night Fae soulbinds. It's not too bad. So especially in Naya, I could see a good case to play that instead. But I think overall they're kind of all viable.
No, I agree. The only thing that was like gimmicky a little bit playing Beast Mastery is that sometimes, depending on the boss movement, you would see your pet, instead of following the path of the boss, run completely counterclockwise across the Azeroth in the middle, and your pet would just be on a marathon, which you would then figure out later that what's going on, why is my kill command not going off? That's probably because your pet is on a run. So that's something to be on the lookout for. Also saw that with Demo Warlocks as well. Sometimes they would have their Tyrant fall in a hole or something, and that would of course reduce your damage done. So there's definitely some gimmicky stuff going around with the pet AI on that fight, so that's something to look into, which is why you will see marksmanship being the more popular ranged spec. But if they do fix the pet AI on that fight so it becomes better, BM could definitely be a solid choice for progressing on that fight.
Regardless though, great tier overall. One to remember for sure. And yeah, the year of the spear was actually came true. We had a lot more survival hunters than ever before, and it was an exciting time to be part of that. And yeah, let's hope that the next year is also the year of the spear. Let's hope it's not just a one-off. So thank you so much for listening in. If you did enjoy these kind of videos, make sure to leave a comment below. We might have talked a little bit too much, but in our defense, we did have all of the different specs to talk about. It wasn't just the usual one spec and one soulbind and that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment if you want to see more of these kind of videos, maybe for other classes, and make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel.
Yeah, thank you so much for watching, guys. Like Roger said, make sure, if you like this video, let us know in the comment section below. Let us know if there's anything else you would like to see in the future. Give us some good content ideas. We just want to bring you guys the best content possible. So make sure to let us know in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.
Have a good one.
Yeah!
Big shout out Curseforge for sponsoring today's video. With the Curseforge desktop app, you can manage, download, and update all of your favorite add-ons in one place. And most importantly, Curseforge makes sure that the creators are properly supported. Click the link in the description below to download the desktop app today.